history of World War II is one of incredible complexity. Many different factors, economic, political, and social, blended together to give rise to the never-before-seen conflict. First and foremost was the war's predecessor, World War I. Through the Treaty of Versailles, Germany had received the short end of the stick. They were forced to take responsibility for the war and pay reparations, as well as suffer substantial restrictions on their military. It cultivated bitterness and a desire for revenge amongst the German people, which Hitler would later use to his advantage. The Great Depression worsened Germany's economic situation, and Hitler's promise to bring Germany back from its financial ruin was a key platform which garnered his political support. European leaders in Britain and France also followed a policy of appeasement, believing that by letting Hitler do as he wanted would immediately avoid conflict and calm him down. Europe's appeasement policy instead saw Hitler take bolder and bolder actions until World War II was upon them. The League of Nations' lack of military power and unity among its participants was also a factor which allowed Hitler to run unchecked for so long. While all these elements were playing out, nationalism was also on the rise, and countries such as Germany, Japan, and Italy would lean toward dictators and parties who promised the glory of their nations. Just like World War I, World War II was a total war. Countries mobilized resources from all aspects of society, including industry, finance, and labor for the war effort. War targets were also expanded beyond strategic military targets to civilian areas and key infrastructure. The war also had a drastic effect on the home front as well, causing mass immigration within the United States as families were relocated for better paying war jobs. Roughly 70 million would perish due to the war, and the war's environmental impact was immeasurable. The desire to hold any sort of advantage in the war propelled countries to pursue technological advances in their military. The most infamous case is the United States atomic bomb, 2 of which were dropped on Japan at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, killing an upwards of 200,000. The event signaled a new age of warfare, one of which boasted a new level of destruction and brutality. Tanks also made their debut in World War II. While ineffective in World War I, their design was advanced and they became a staple form of warfare in World War II. Britain created radar, a system they used to defend against Germany during the latter's invasion. Primitive computers and penicillin were also developed as a result of the war. The German Blitzkrieg was one of the most infamous war tactics to play out in World War II. Tested out in the Spanish Civil War, the Blitzkrieg was a quick form of offensive warfare used to strike a swift, powerful blow to the enemy forces before they could react. Germany also developed U-boats, an innovative submarine model which would devastate patrols on coastlines and hunt using wolf pack tactics. The attacks from U-boats were so effective, the Allies had to set up a convoy system and use warships to protect smaller, more vulnerable ships. Japanese pilots carried out suicide attacks called kamikaze, by flying their planes into enemy targets. The tactic grew in popularity within Japan after a pilot chose to commit the suicide attack at Pearl Harbor. With so many secret messages regarding war plans being sent around different fronts, cryptography became another battlefield in World War II. Cracking enemy codes and securing information on future war plans was of the utmost importance for every single force in World War II. The Nazis were radically anti-Semitic. They would falsely accuse Jews for causing Germany's social, economic, political, and cultural problems. They would also blame them for Germany's defeat in World War I. The Nazi persecution of Jews became increasingly radical between 1933 and 1945. Legal discrimination in the form of anti-Semitic laws, various forms of public identification and exclusion, organized violence, physical displacement, internment, widespread theft and plunder, and forced labor were some established policies that resulted in the lives of many Jews. In 1939, Jews were forced into ghettos where they lived in overcrowded and unsanitary conditions, the 2 largest being Warsaw and Lodz? I don't know, it's really late, I don't feel like doing this anymore. The ghettos were used to isolate and control the Jewish population, and in 1941, they began liquidating the ghettos. The Nazis decided to implement a final solution. This final solution was the organized systematic mass murder of European Jews. The majority were murdered in mass shootings and killing centers deliberately located near the large ghettos. There were other victims of Nazi persecution, and murder, including political opponents, Jehovah's Witnesses, men accused of homosexuality, Afro-Germans, Gypsies, Poles, Soviet officials, Soviet POWs, and the physically and mentally disabled. Concentration camps and death camps were also used for the mass genocide. Posters, movies, and cartoons were some forms used as propaganda to boost morale. Nationalism plays a huge role in the use of propaganda as it boosts the nation's citizens to help in the war effort. In Germany, German propaganda would emphasize the prowess of the German army and contrasted it with the British and Allied armies. They would be depicted as cowards and butchers, or brave but misguided. Russians would be presented as dehumanized beasts and killers. In Britain, British propaganda came in the form of British Political Warfare Executive, created by Winston Churchill. They would do radio broadcasts, and by 1945 they would establish over 40 clandestine pseudo-German radio stations using powerful American transmitters. They also delivered submersive messages to the German people through black propaganda, printed postcards and leaflets dropped behind enemy lines. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, the Office of War Information was a source of American propaganda used to boost wartime production. OWI photographers would take photos of home front life and women in the workforce. The defeat at the Battle of Britain, the failure of Operation Barbarossa, Pearl Harbor, and the Battle of Midway are some of the turning point battles in World War II. Great Britain's successful defense against the Germans was a huge turning point in the war. They displayed courage and resilience against German aggression and made winning a possibility for the Allies. The failure of Operation Barbarossa was another major turning point in World War II. Operation Barbarossa was most notably the largest German invasion of the Soviet Union. Germany would suffer massive casualties, thus marking the turning point of the war. In the Pacific, the attack on Pearl Harbor was a turning point, as it launched the US to join the war after declaring neutrality. The devastation of the attack also boosted American morale, which aided in wartime production. The Battle of Midway was one of the most important American naval victories in World War II. The Japanese hadn't lost a naval battle in more than 50 years at this point, and nearly had destroyed the American fleet at Pearl Harbor. The Battle of Midway turned the tide of war as American military and intelligence forces worked together to defeat the Japanese. Deciphering Japanese naval code, allowing the US to anticipate Japanese maneuvers. At the end of World War II, Europe and Asia had been demolished by war. Millions dead and millions more homeless. The European economy collapsed and their industrial infrastructure had been destroyed. In 1947, the Marshall Plan was introduced, in which the US would allocate $13 billion, or roughly $151 billion today, for reconstruction, rebuilding things such as buildings, railroad tracks, bridges, and roads. The United Nations would be created for internal cooperation and diplomacy. Decolonization would increase, giving independence to India, Indonesia, the Philippines, and Arab nations. Communist influence would rise in Southeast Asia, creating the Chinese Communist Party. Two superpowers would rise from the decline of European colonial empires, the Soviet Union and the United States. They would later become competitors in the Cold War.